welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is second in a group of 6, presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 3. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to examine the whole of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am, and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score, with the second stave on page 171 as Wotan and Loge enter. A rather dim cello-viola flurry of Loge's sinking chord note module atop a final sostenuto low brass chord with timpani roll announces the entrance of Wotan and Loge. They launch another quasi-recitative dialogue with Mime, its more continuously syntax-laden web a testament to the Meister's rapidly burgeoning grasp of his sonic language, and how to deploy it as a precision tool in his musical narrative. The fire god begins over the lingering brass chord by announcing the locale, then observing, "Was blitzen dort feurisch Funken?" to explain the previous brief interlude's pictorial touches over a softly threatening 7th pedal in the brass and continued timpani roll. His vocal arpeggiates down in bright tonic major, including an inversion of the final Erde melody notes through a suitably dismal inverted Ash interval, followed by a Welterb triad, rises in a chord note opposition, separated by a 3rd lift, then moves through a pair of triplet melody notes. The last concludes by falling a minor 6th to produce Chagrin, a furtive hint at the surprises he's arranged for his divine master to witness in this dangerous place, who, taken aback by the horrible marvels he's already seen, remains largely silent throughout. Above the Nibelung tattoo in low strings, the beleaguered Mime responds to these visitors with 3 graced moans doubled by oboes in chord notes, and as he does, violins, violas rise and fall on a harmonization of that inverted giant turn built from opposing melody notes. It's Loge's Scene 2 advice to Wotan on how to steal the ring, and Mime is certainly the place to start. On a side note, the gods do enter at exactly the right spot to achieve that goal, a 19th century convention audiences don't tend to notice, though Krebil's doubter hisses, "Ain't that convenient?" The Copenhagen Ring addresses this minor believability snag by setting the scene in Alberich's laboratory, where Loge would know he's most likely to be found. As the meter shifts to common time, and over the string's lingering pedal chord, Wotan wonders at the thing hidden in the rocks, a chord note opposition in his voice that moves through a reverse Ash interval, followed by the Nibelung turn, which might also be Alberich's dictatorial module. 2 oboes punctuate him with a whining chord note pulse, and Loge goads the dwarf a cappella, dropping a 3rd and rising a 5th in an echo of that subtle longing for the ring, to pass through chord notes and finish on a downward 3rd. This triggers a hail of the beleaguered dwarf's whines in cut time, for chord note strophes reinforced and echoed by strings, atop whose fading pedal the fire god presses Mime in a switch back to common time, the shifting meter differentiating gods from Nibelung. Loge bounces on Erdefourths and a heroic melody note inversion to rise in their original form through a low Ash interval into another Nibelung turn suspiciously resembling Alberich's tyranny in a subtle echo of Wotan's immediately prior use of the module. Strings whimper 2 more chord notes, and a cappella, the dwarf offers weak resistance to a pair of chord notes, the first on a triplet, the second making the line as a whole reverse melody notes. Loge wryly offers his help, punctuated by 3 staccato chords in cellos and violas, a line begun mocking the dwarf's paired chord notes, the first on an identical triplet. From there, he lifts by 3rds that, despite intervening quaver rests, outline an abandonment triad. Its final note on a sostenuto viola cello crotchet, the fire sprite ends with a syntactic twitch joining two emergent modules which inform a great deal of what follows. This seemingly passing vocal begins with the strophe which concatenates two modules, Fricka's resistance to her consort and the distinctive Rheinmaiden cell connoting chagrin. This idiosyncratic mix, first heard in Scene 2 on Wotan's, then Fafner's lips, has only just crystallized in Alberich's threatening vocal, also revealing its two elements are retrograde inversions of one another. It's a conjunction destined to sound primarily in Loge's vocals, sign of his manipulative relations, first with both Nibelung brothers, then beyond. Its two constituent cells continue to sound independently, however, each with a syntactic life of its own during Rheingold, mostly in vocals. Their presence in the orchestral web is limited until they spread throughout Valkyrie. Loge's offer inspires a meter shift back to cut time as, atop a pair of bassoons, Mime opens up about his brother's tyranny, his vocal following three strophes of Cook's scheming. Though recognizable here, it goes through an ascending trio of pulses, which trade the morphemes falling sevenths for tritones, to end on a ring fragment. Atop this bundle, the dwarf's line doubles with three echoing reverse ash intervals on tritones, then static notes, concluding ironically with Flosshilda's heroic module over bassoons which sink on the fragment. This obvious case of the fire god's finesse, raising Mime's confidence so he reveals what he's reluctant to tell, reinforces scheming as a marker specific to Loge's covert powers at work. Disingenuously, he goads Mime again, wondering how Alberich acquired his power. As he does, the continuous bassoon line shifts to a pair of air chords punctuated by viola Nibelung twitches, Loge's vocal dropping a third into reverse melody notes, then up a third and second to end on the heroic module, both echoing and taunting the dwarf. But Mime is hooked, and, warming to his subject, answers over a pair of bassoon clarinet modules that, begun with scheming in its current tritone mode, rise on a ring fragment inversion, weirdly invoking Alberich's threats. Cellos, violas punctuate each of these with rising pizzicato arpeggios, identical to those which introduce scheming in Scene 2, leaving scant doubt it's specific to Loge's influence, like a sly nod between the fire god and Wotan that it worked well enough on the giants. This introduction to the dwarf's portrait of the Nibelung race before and after his brother's tyranny molds his vocal to the bassoon clarinet figures, the scheming tritones shaped as reverse ash intervals to ascend with the fragment inversion on heroic melody notes, and a grisly inverted ash interval plunging an octave on Alberich's name. Mime goes on to describe the Nibelung's enthrall to the ring, his vocal and abandonment triad that doubles woodwinds, though moving through a low ash interval into a static, immediately capped with the Welterbe triad, shaped as an inverted interval, a succinct bouquet of Mime's helplessness against Alberich's burgeoning racial powers, never mind his fellow dwarves' thrall to them. Violas add a delicious tremolo frisson to the words Zittern wir staunen, as woodwinds whisper an altered ring strophe whose rising half the dwarf follows with chagrin, rather feeble on a descending third, and ends by ceremoniously dubbing his people Der Nibelungen nächtiges Heer, a phrase Alberich himself soon uses to intimidate his divine visitors, with consequences for all that follows. Mime's vocal ironically takes a variant of the Rheinmaiden's joyful cell, complete with its Welterbe triad, its rising pitch a hopeful fifth, only to be concluded in a reverse ash interval on a baleful descending fifth, its cadential formula of air chords on clarinets, bassoons, punctuated by low-string pizzicati. Mime's narrative, his backstory of recent events in Nibelheim, starts with a bucolic on the life his peaceable dwarf comrades led before Alberich's ring. The orchestra's meter returning to triple time, pizzicato string chords insidiously repeat air chords to punctuate a duo of solo horns in soft alternation outlining a slowed ostinato version of the truncated Nibelung tattoo. Mime's vocal, still in duple, reinforces the passage's song-like quality with 3 pairs of lines which echo like a folk tune. The first pair echoes falling scales, begun on reverse ash intervals in sly parody of the spear. The next pair, both chord note oppositions, reveal the dwarves were once merry craftsmen, their skills devoted to jewelry for their women. Vibern sung on a high ash interval to the heroic rising fifth. A figure echoed in the second pulse with the upward fifth intoned as a grace, all to underline the resolute but gentle natural purity of Nibelungs before their enslavement. This arietta's first segment deliberately restrains its tempo, whose coda is a last pair of echoing strophes, especially interesting in light of what they become to Mime during Siegfried. Mime's vocal continues its song-like echoes by marrying 2 reverse melody note strophes, partially doubled at the lower third by first horn. After second horn repeats the tattoo, it continues by doubling the vocal, this time sung to an unbroken downward scale which nonetheless may be construed as a reverse melody note strophe followed by a 4-note scale, both lines maintaining the distinctive Nibelung rhythm. Each of these vocals is graced, the first by a turn, the second an appoggiatura, which tellingly interpolates with the rising fifth to create an abandonment triad. Both these sorts of graces, along with the example's falling vocal lines, make up a great deal of Mime's singing from this point forward, and it is indicative they occur just as he brings his tale of dwarfish happiness to an end. After a brief wordless coda, 2 second horn strophes of the Nibelung tattoo, the narrative's second half darkens to contrast the dwarves' original idyll with the ring's distortion of it. A quicker tempo, allmählich schneller, fuels its ever-increasing urgency as, joined after 8 measures by contrabasses, cellos mutter a succession of tattoos. After 2 measures, low woodwinds begin a series of chord notes in their minor mode incarnation. While this begins with 2 strophes of Cook's servitude, for the duration of the narrative's second half they sound as the chords themselves, further cementing the note's basis in air syntax. Molded by them while describing the toil of his fellow dwarves, Mime's doubling vocal is a series of chord note oppositions, broken in the middle by a low ash interval on a fourth. His phrase crests with a broad, static ash interval, pegging Alberich as their labor's sole beneficiary, while 3 woodwind chords eerily foreshadow Alberich's Scene 4 curse, as his brother finishes with reverse melody notes and a falling third. Violins and violas then resume the air chords for another 5 measures, Mime's vocal a frantic modification of his immediately previous one, thus stressing the narrative's overall song-like form, bewailing Alberich's insatiable greed. After only a single chord note opposition, he lifts a third through a low ash interval into an extended melody note pulse, whose last pitches rise on 2 low ash intervals, topped by a reverse on a third, from which he rises a fourth, another ringlust echo. He ends this phrase by telescoping the previous refrain's conclusion into a pair of chord notes. Woodwinds twice sound the chords themselves in the Rhine Maiden's pulse and harmony, over the last of which he falls a prescient 7th into a static ash interval, then leaps up a third into a pair of static notes as violins, violas take over the double air chord strophes, gradually darkening their harmony, thus leading to the narrative's climax, itself a particularly revealing passage. The sequence rises to its apex in both orchestra and vocal on a rapid series of harmonically lifting air chords. To cap this ascent, a pair of ring fragments lead immediately to their elongation and echo shortened by half of their behavior at the end of the Scene 2-3 interlude, modules shot through with overlapping Welterb triads. As the example begins, Mime's vocal at last switches to the orchestra's triple time to intone a trio of chord notes or servitude, doubling the orchestra's chords, going on through a static and low-ash interval. All this sounds over a continuous stream of decayed Nibelung tattoo modules in octavo low strings. The passage's text is especially instructive, describing the physical process by which ore is converted from its useless raw state to a form Alberich can employ for his malign purposes. This, of course, is a direct parallel to what Mime explains has happened to the dwarves themselves, who've been transformed from happy smiths into miserable slaves. Mime's narrative definitively realizes the Scene 2-3 interlude's implications by at last making explicit Loge's hint in the Scene 2 panegyric. There, its syntax literally mutates towards something quite different from what it's been, an unnerving portrait of what results from natural power twisted against itself. The climax of Mime's narrative allies this sinister racial evolution, frantic with pain and confusion, to the ring fragment, whose Welterbe triads with their roots in Alberich's lust for the Rhine maidens, the ring, and Wotan's idea of Valhalla's power, which Loge identifies in Scene 2 as the magic by which Alberich forges the ring. Meanwhile, the narrative's body is shot through with reverse melody notes, whose implications of racial change weave insidiously through the drama's syntactic web. During the Ring's next 3 chapters, these modules continue to develop associations of race as they warp into syntax seemingly removed from their originals. Yet as here, they're often closely attended by Erda in the form of her chords and chord notes. Mime concludes his narrative as unison octavo horns and woodwinds hammer out the song's cadence with alternating tattoo cells, leaping down a third, up a second, down a fourth, up another second, down a tritone, then up a last fourth, strings wrapping them in demi-semiquaver scale twitches that alternate down and up, that emergent sonic Nibelung trait. The dwarf's vocal precisely follows these intervals to finish over the 5-1 resolution on extended melody notes, strings reduced to a pair of quaver chords. Horn's woodwinds answer by twice shouting the Nibelung tattoo, then a pair of truncated pulses, while banging out 4 erda-chord strophes, punctuated by 5 elongated string scales racing up demi-semiquaver sextuplets. Flutes and a piccolo surmount the passage's final 3 measures with a trill appoggiatura whose twisted sensuality is neither out of place with this analysis' claims nor with the passage's overall context. Hailing back to Scene 1's Rhine maiden frolics, the trill appoggiatura recalls sexual energy, Loge's influence, and the subsequent breeding which this alteration of the Nibelung race implies, never mind its cause, the sublimation of Alberich's sexual urge. Its elongated appoggiatura brings the arietta to a close on a sharp quaver chord across the ensemble. Loge jumps right back in to press for details of Alberich's prior attack, an a cappella line moving through an inversion of the final heroic melody notes, which the fire god playfully caps, bouncing on thirds into a taunting Rhine-maiden cell with its abandonment triad. Violins rush up a demi-semiquaver scale into a glib sting that provokes the dwarf's response. This seems a gratuitous recap, since the brothers' previous tiff establishes what's to be Mime's motivation throughout the tetralogy, meaning acquisition of the ring in hopes of becoming master of the world in his brother's place. Yet the lesser dwarf revisits the confrontation at greater length to provide new elements vital to understanding much of the tale as it unfolds, not only here in Rheingold, but as it applies to Fafner's Valkyr dragon transformation, Mime's reappearance in Siegfried, and finally the Tarnhelm's role in Götterdämmerung. It begins simply enough, the dwarf telling them, "Mich ärmsten ach, mich zwang zum ärgsten." Supported only by 3 punctuating quaver string chords, his quasi-recitative vocal falls on chord notes, rises on reverse chord notes, isolated between quaver rests, then descends on reverse melody notes and a last chord note pulse. The vocal is straightforward, but despite appearances, its text isn't. Productions tend to downplay the ring's supernatural elements, modernist versions transforming them into real-world hardware or eliminating them altogether, and this is a perfect example of why that's a mistake. The dwarf's subtle implication, the extreme difficulty of manipulating the Tarnhelm, is an idea crucial to the bauble's role in the coming drama, one with important repercussions for every character who encounters it. Passing over this sequence in Rheingold lightly sets up believability issues fated to dog any production to its end. Horns murmur an adapted version of the Tarnhelm morpheme, its rising-falling air-to-chord module lingering over their first chord as static violas tap out abridged Nibelung tattoos. While violas beat the same tattoo on its first chord, horns sound the Tarnhelm's first coda, which, it should be recalled, consists of the air to melody. Atop this syntactic bundle, the dwarf's vocal outlines a pair of echoing song-like lines with telling variants. Both end on chagrin, also built from melody notes. The first, however, traces a reverse ash interval on a third to produce a Welterb triad, while the second intones a high interval only to plunge from it on a fifth, thus missing the triad, yet still finish on chagrin. A succinct clue Mime has yet to grasp the full measure of Alberich's racial plans. The first Tarnhelm coda follows with the same abridged tattoo twitch, leading to horns weirdly truncating the Tarnhelm's second portion. Just as Mime's understanding of its magic is incomplete, they repeat 2 pulses of its first half's air-to-chords, the rhythm of each this time altered to a kind of stutter on inverted ash intervals, its coda excised, a further hint the dwarf imperfectly grasps what he's wrought. Thus accompanied, Mime's vocal is another pair of echoing refrains, both launched by plunging octaves, that power he can't master, the first moving through a static ash interval to fall on chord notes, followed by melody notes, the last built on a static triplet to sync through chord notes, again finished by melody notes. This sequence alone, with its tight bundle of air-to-centric modules, especially given the syntax's close Loge associations, allows little doubt Bovala's hand is in the Tarnhelm's power. But the Meister subtly manipulates its second half, as Alberich's brother describes how voll merkisch klug, welch mächtige Kraft zu eigen dem Werk, truncating and distorting it while Mime sings plunging octaves, chord notes, and melody notes, all sly hints of those powers the dwarf cannot fathom. It's at this point he breaks from the passage's refrain-like construction, as, after a static ash interval, his vocal plunges a fifth, while viola's cellos ascend on chords outlining melody notes in their elongated form, to conclude with the Vala's chords themselves. Mime doubles this progression while moving through a trio of ash intervals, first a static, then a low, and another static to rise a third, then fall on a spear scale, the entire line eerily foreshadowing Erde Twilight, as he reveals his plan to keep the Tarnhelm and turn it against Alberich, a scheme the syntax dooms at Erde's unseen behest. Bassoons tap out a monotone strophe pair and altered Nibelung rhythm with supporting pizzicato viola cello chords, the dwarf's vocal at first halting static notes, telegraphing his uncertainty, then a static ash interval. At this point, as he fantasizes of the delights in overcoming his brother, the ensemble changes to a series of 8 semi-quaver-quaver first-second bassoon melody note pulses, each launched by third bassoon graced crotchets on first and third beats of every measure. The first 2 echo one another, the third rises a half step only to fall back on the fourth, while the last 4 progressively rise. Mime follows this harmonic motion, bouncing down then up a syncopated third, then rising on reverse chord notes into a chord note opposition, separated by a third lift. His second opposition, after a semiquaver rest, moves through a static ash interval, rises through more reverse chord notes, into a low ash interval on a third, again capped by chord notes. After a dotted crotchet rest, he moves to the idea of seizing the ring, ascending another third into a Welterb triad. His vocal from this point roughly doubles bassoon violas harmonized at a third in two puckish strophes of the ring's embryonic form, violas at a disturbing offset, each concluding on a 6-note scale, the last 3 of each ascent taking the Nibelung's long-short-long pulse in subtle reminder of Wotan's Scene 2 appreciation of both Valhalla and the ring. Mime sinks to the bottom of the first to sing a jarring tritone leap on the word entreißen, to move through hesitant static notes separated by quaver rests. A third bassoon supports both morpheme pulses with a long trill appoggiatura, reinforcing the idea that much of the ring's power lies in distorted sexual urges, which Mime now shares, while cymbal strikes inject Valhalla ash intervals on every other measure. Mime's dream, after all, is to control his race and seize the god's hegemony in the same way his brother envisions, which necessarily entails loveless sexual reproduction. He leaps into the second ring pulse on another harsh tritone, sinking from it a third into a static ash interval. But a falling, rising tritone separated by a quaver rest scars his vocal, and the hapless dwarf concludes his fevered power meditation as bassoons intone cadential Erde chords, each triggered by the cymbal's Valhalla ash intervals, his vocal rising a third into a crib of his prior Nibelung tale, ended on a wild, vainly hopeful, graced rising octave. Supported by pizzicato string pulses and a cymbal roll, woodwind's horns respond in a hectic coda, 2 embryonic ring strophes, the 6 rising notes in both iterations taking the Nibelung's long-short-long pulse, while the cymbal roll changes to a measure of taps in the tattoo rhythm to fitfully die away on Valhalla ash pulses, interspersed with single strikes, all of it churning the dizzy foolishness of Mime's fantasy. Loge goads him again, asking why the hapless dwarf's plan failed, on a downward fifth launched by a static ash pulse ended with the Rhine maidens taunting, violas, cellos muttering an odd half-cadence as a Tarnhelm crib. A duo of pizzicato quaver string chords punctuate Mime, who begins his explanation with static notes which become a more leisurely low ash pulse on reverse chord notes, capped with a falling Erde fourth. This triggers an eerily whispered reprise on horns, bassoons, and English horn of the complete Tarnhelm morpheme. For its initial segment, his vocal taps out a halting monotone line, but with a single ash interval to distinguish it, yet whose text imparts a key bit of information. Ach, der das Werk ich wirkte, den Zauber, den ihm entzugt, den Zauber erreicht ich nicht recht. This answers a question which perceptive listeners must ask when Alberich wrests the Tarnhelm from its maker, that being, why Mime hasn't already used it to make himself invisible and seize his brother's ring. In addressing this immediate concern, however, the dwarf's admission raises other questions which impact the drama in the long term. After Rheingold, 2 characters invoke the Tarnhelm's powers, Fafnir to transform himself into a dragon, and Siegfried to masquerade as Gunther, then carry himself in a twinkling from Brunhilde's Rock to Gebetjung Hall. In the Volsung's case, one may assume Hagen shares the needed spells, even if productions never show that exchange. Fafnir's case is more problematic. The Tarnhelm is flung on the Horde without comment, which Fafnir carts off as if unaware of its powers. Loge, the one god who might tell him, limits his comments to the ring, and those only to Fasolt, whose outraged reaction goads Fafnir to murder. After release, Alberich is unlikely to share this enigma with the surviving giant, though Loge might. Yet these are hypothetical colloquies absent from the text, and it's still harder to credit Fafnir might hit on the spell for himself. Analysts criticize the Meister for this or that supposed lapse in narrative logic, often due to an incomplete grasp of the work's overall reasoning. This case, however, must be laid at Wagner's door, nor is it trivial, since without its reconciliation, the work's narrative coherence is appreciably weakened from Valkyrie onward. Unfortunately, since the Meister doesn't answer the question in his text, it can only be solved in production, where it has never yet been addressed. Mime continues atop the second Tarnhelm segment with an echoing pair of static lines finished with low-ash intervals on Erde fourths, the first punctuated by a rising viola demi-semi-quaver Nibelung scale, the second by two of them, sonic twitches to depict his loss of the bauble. Over the last Tarnhelm coda, after intoning static notes capped with a static ash interval and plunging fifth, he continues through another pair of echoing lines, the first roughly following the morpheme's turn, ending on melody notes, the second a low interval on another third into an identical turn, as woodwinds rest on a cadential chord preparing the brief tale of his punishment. The mood grows progressively more frantic as first violins twice race down Nibelung demi-semiquaver scalar twitches, then 4 times up semiquaver triplets and a last pulse in demi-semiquavers, all atop sustained tremolo strings with harmonies reminiscent of the scene's first measures. Disjointed by strategically placed rests, the dwarf's vocal leaps up a fourth, falls on chord notes to rise a third, then their reversal, from which he traces a version of the heroic cell on a fourth, to climb in a hectic mix, falling then rising on thirds into a pair of chord note strophes, the second graced and capped by a last note reversal. He falls mostly silent for 2 measures which reproduce the whining chord note reversal modules with which his earlier whines began scene 3, this time feverishly peppered first with 2 rising then 2 falling demi-semiquaver first violin scales. He concludes miserably in static notes, ending on reverse melody notes, a pathetic grace on that module's last pitch which, after a pungent quaver rest, he caps with a plunging fifth, strings emphasizing this strong hint of resignation, first legato, then with 2 quaver punctuations, the last graced in first violins to echo his vocal. The Lament's orchestral coda consists of 2 racing iterations of the extended ring on massed woodwinds, tremolo violas, punctuated by syncopated horn pulses and Nibelung twitches on first and second violins. To complete the sonic picture, atop it, a piccolo intones a trill appoggiatura, yet this echo of his previous coda develops a syntactic mystery with surprising ramifications for the epic. Limited to woodwind strings, this better highlights Mime's frustrated optimism as portrayed by a decisive syntactic evolution. The descending cells precisely reproduce the ring fragment, but their rising modules elongate melody notes comprising the ring morpheme's second half into a chained pair, making each a distinctive 6-note rising scale. This change is foreshadowed when the ring sounds earlier to end Mime's fantasy about toppling Alberich, but here it loses those syncopations on its melody notes to make the line a smooth upward climb. In Siegfried, as Mime again raises his hopes for triumphs, this syntax acquires definitive meaning from the dwarf's aspiration to kill his orphaned Welsung, thus win the ring and free himself at last from the tyranny of both his brother and Siegfried. Outside that narrow context, however, its broader terms imply a world after the hero's death, one that's free of both Alberich's and Wotan's domination. In this sense, it looks forward to the tetralogy's ultimate message. This coda finishes with another iteration of the fragment, by now a bona fide morpheme with connotation distinct from that of the ring alone. During the dwarf's previous scene, and separate from his private concerns, it reinforces the module's sign of a nascent racial charge, meaning the power of Alberich's ring to dominate his own, and, he hopes, all other races. As discussed when the ring's syntax first appears in Scene 1, the operative words attached to it are Welterbe, from the beginning a concept specifically allied to the fragment itself. In this most recent incident, first violins scurry down bundles of extended reverse melody notes, largely obscuring the morpheme as they heighten the comedy of Mima's hapless distress, but also implying it isn't he who'll benefit from the syntax's racial implications. The question of that beneficiary remains to be answered, which the syntax reveals in good time. As 5 Nibelung twitches fade on first violins, a measure of staccato cello pulses lead to a pedal chord sweetened by 2 horns, while Loge notes in an aside to Wotan the difficulty of their mission, his voice rising in the heroic melody notes, capped by chord notes, then his distinctive opposition bundle. As strings warm to major mode, the god responds that he relies on the fire god's cunning, tritones bouncing in his vocal to become a chord note opposition, completed by the melody notes themselves. This inspires low strings to skitter through 2 measures of Loge material, as Mima finally notices how unusual his visitors are. Over low woodwind chords and string pizzicati, he wonders what they're about. A pair of descending sevenths in his voice, the fire god's manipulation, separating chord notes and heroic melody notes to underline their power. As strings trade weirdly distorted yet merry cribs on Loge's falling chord note module, the fire sprite claims they've come as liberators, voice falling a fourth to rise after a quaver rest on extended melody notes, in parody both of Wotan and Mima. He continues with a jibe for the dwarf alone on Flosshilda's heroic cell, begun with grace and finished by a falling major arpeggio, itself a veiled taunt at the ring fragment. It's worth noting this vocal line also conceals that giant opposing turn, which telegraphs their intent to steal the ring. It's here we'll take a pause before Alberich parades his Nibelung slaves in front of the shocked immortals. The next video picks up where this one leaves off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 180. As always, thanks for watching and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel is by itself a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.